When Fire Chief Rebecca Beck Hastings, first set eyes on Larkspur Heights, I thought I'd found an idyllic suburban community. Low traffic, neatly trimmed lawns, and a broad cul-de-sac of pastel-colored homes gave it the look of a postcard. My work in the city rarely left me time to relax, so discovering a peaceful neighborhood on the outskirts was a gift. I relocated here hoping to enjoy quiet weekends away from the sirens, bustle, and stress that came with being the city's fire chief. From the start, neighbors seemed friendly enough, or so I believed. A few introduced themselves when I moved in. Mr. Contreras across the street, who offered to help me set up my mailbox, or Ms. Mallory next door, who brought brownies. But there was one person who stood out like a sore thumb at the community's welcoming picnic. A woman in her mid-50s, with meticulously coiffed hair and a perpetual scowl. Her name was Marjorie Annette, though I soon learned everyone sarcastically called her Karen. She belonged to the Larkspur Heights Homeowners Association, a body that, at first glance, seemed to have only mild authority regarding lawn length and holiday decorations. Karen wore her badge of HOA enforcer proudly. She strolled from table to table at the picnic, issuing subtle criticisms. That dessert has too much sugar for our community guidelines, or you're not allowed to place your coolers so close to the playground. The others mostly shrugged, rolling their eyes when she marched away. I tried to be polite in our brief conversation, but her curt, "I hope you'll keep your yard in compliance," left a chilly impression. Having served many years in the city's fire department, rising up from rookie firefighter to chief, I dealt with all sorts of personalities. A little rudeness wasn't going to faze me. I had no idea how deeply Karen's controlling streak ran, nor how it would entangle me in a fiasco that threatened to burn down more than just my tranquility. The first real sign of friction arrived about a month after I settled in. The Larkspur Heights HOA announced a plan to expand the neighborhood's community garden. The existing plots, located at the far end of the cul-de-sac behind a row of pines, were modest raised beds containing tomatoes, herbs, and a few flowers. Because these gardens had been such a hit, the HOA board, minus Karen, ironically, voted to double their size. When the official expansion day came, volunteers gathered to clear more ground, build new raised beds, and truck in fresh soil. Families brought seeds, from cucumbers to sunflowers. Children trotted around, squealing with excitement about growing their own plants. I'd grown up gardening, so I was thrilled to help. Shoveling dirt and planting seeds felt like a welcome break from the intensity of city emergencies. Yet Karen was conspicuously absent until near the end. She showed up in a crisp outfit wholly unsuited for manual labor, lips pursed. She circled the new beds and sniffed. "Are we sure this expansion is authorized? It might invite pests." She pointed at a patch of marigolds. "Flowers bring bees. Bees sting. And we already have enough problems with bugs." I found her comment odd. Gardens naturally have pollinators, and bees are essential to many plants. But Karen's expression suggested she found them not just unwelcome, but downright threatening. She confronted Ms. Mallory, who led the project, demanding extra pest control measures. Ms. Mallory tried to calm her, explaining that the garden would use natural solutions, like companion planting, to ward off harmful insects. Karen's scowl deepened. "These gardens will attract more bugs. That means more spiders, more wasps, more ants," she shuddered as though describing a plague. "Don't say I didn't warn you when this place becomes overrun." We let it pass, hoping she'd forget her fuss. After all, most neighbors love the community gardens. Who wouldn't appreciate fresh produce and a space to socialize? But behind Karen's complaints lurked something more than mere annoyance. She harbored a genuine hatred for the creepy crawlies that any garden inevitably brings. If only we'd known how far she was willing to go to solve that perceived problem, we might have intervened earlier. The expanded garden thrived that summer. Rows of leafy lettuce, bell peppers, and bright zinnias filled the new raised beds. Families took turns watering in the mornings or evenings, sharing the harvest among neighbors. A spirit of camaraderie blossomed as children squealed over plump strawberries or chased each other between rows of sunflowers. Even an occasional wasp nest in the corner of the fencing was dealt with calmly, using gentle deterrence rather than scorched earth extermination. Karen, however, wasn't pleased. She stormed through the garden at least once a week, complaining about everything from ugly trellises to suspicious insects. She badgered the HOA board, wrote lengthy emails about how the garden posed a public health risk, and circulated flyers that read, "Bugs spread disease. Stop the garden overgrowth." Despite her efforts, few neighbors sympathized, chalking it up to her usual overzealousness. I was typically too swamped with work to delve into these petty squabbles. My days involved station visits, training drills, city council meetings about fire safety codes, and the occasional emergency response. By the time I got home, I wanted nothing more than to relax, tend to my little patch of tomatoes, and say a quick hello to the garden crew. One balmy evening in early August, though, I bumped into Karen near the garden fence. She was perched by a bed of cucumbers, peering suspiciously at some cabbage moth caterpillars. I offered a friendly wave. "Evening, Karen. Everything all right?" She turned, startled. "Oh, Rebecca, correct?" She always used my first name, never acknowledging my rank or position, a small slight, though I chose to ignore it. "I see the pests are getting out of hand. See those caterpillars?" She poked a leaf with her manicured finger. "Disgusting. We need pesticides, or better yet, to scale back the garden. It's become a nuisance." I couldn't help but defend the garden. Most folks enjoy it. Plus, caterpillars can be removed by hand or with natural repellents. "The environment, you know?" Karen scoffed. "Environment? This is about maintaining our property values and not letting bugs infest the neighborhood. But if you're so fond of them, be my guest. Just don't blame me when you regret it." She marched off. As I watched her go, a chill tightened my stomach. Her tone was more ominous than usual. I shook off the sense of unease, assuming her bark was worse than her bite. Little did I realize that behind that scowl lurked a plan, one that would endanger everyone. The day it all began to escalate started like any other. I was at the fire station in the early afternoon, finishing a training exercise with the new cadets, when my phone buzzed with an urgent text. It was Ms. Mallory. "Karen is up to something. She's talking about taking matters into her own hands bugs. Keep an eye out." I frowned. Taking matters into her own hands could mean anything. Maybe she'd buy loads of chemical pesticides, or call an exterminator to spray the entire garden. Though intrusive, that wouldn't necessarily be an emergency. Still, the phrase gave me pause. Later that evening, I returned home, changed into casual clothes, and walked down to the garden. Ms. Mallory was there, anxiously checking the beds. I overheard Karen bragging about having a final solution for the insects, she explained. She refused to elaborate, but seemed oddly gleeful. We found no immediate sign of sabotage. The garden was peaceful, some tomatoes slightly overripe, a few wilted leaves from the summer heat, but nothing unusual. I shrugged, telling Ms. Mallory that if Karen tried anything unethical, we could file a complaint with the HOA or city code enforcement. Ms. Mallory nodded, but worry lingered in her eyes. Over the next week, Karen's presence around the garden was sporadic. She wasn't orchestrating her usual midday tirades, nor was she petitioning the HOA board with new complaints. Instead, she seemed to vanish, which ironically made me more suspicious. Sometimes, silence in a busybody can be the loudest warning. But with no tangible signs of wrongdoing, I had no cause to intervene. Then, one night, I glimpsed Karen sneaking around near midnight. From my bedroom window, I noticed a figure with a flashlight prowling by the trees that bordered the garden. Squinting, I recognized her silhouette, but she disappeared behind the shed before I could see more. My instincts flared. Why was she sneaking around so late? But I was off duty, in pajamas, and had no real basis to confront her. So I watched, unsettled, until she drifted away into the darkness. In the grand scheme, it might have ended as a simple rivalry or a complaint to city authorities, had Karen's meddling not crossed a line into criminal territory. The seeds of her drastic plan were there, waiting to ignite. In a literal sense, one sweltering August afternoon, I left the station earlier than usual after a standard day's tasks. Dark clouds hovered on the horizon, hinting at a thunderstorm that might break the heat. As I stepped out of my truck, I saw Ms. Mallory sprinting up the street. Her eyes were wide, frantic. "Chief Hastings," she gasped, forgetting to use my first name. "You have to come. Something's wrong at the garden." I didn't hesitate. I dashed after her, mind racing with possibilities. Did a storm blow something over? Had the fence collapsed? But as we reached the row of pine trees that separated the houses from the garden area, the acrid smell of smoke hit me. My heart lurched. Smoke in a dry August setting was a recipe for disaster. Sure enough, plumes of grayish-white smoke curled skyward. Tongues of flame licked the edge of the farthest raised bed. A patch of straw mulch that lined the walkway was ablaze, flames crackling and spreading through the dry tinder. Already, a portion of the garden fence was catching fire. Someone shouted in panic, and neighbors scrambled to toss buckets of water. Without thinking, I switched into firefighting mode. Everyone back away. I barked, taking command. Mallory, call 911. The rest of you, keep your distance. Do not attempt to fight the fire if it's bigger than a small spot. Yes, I was the city's fire chief, but I had no gear here, no radio. Even so, I knew the station was just a quick drive away. Within a minute, Ms. Mallory was on the phone, yelling details. Meanwhile, I grabbed a garden hose, cursing the low water pressure. The flames licked hungrily across the mulch, creeping toward the newly expanded beds loaded with more straw and wooden lattice. The dryness of the season turned the garden into a tinderbox. Neighbors poured out of their homes, some in pajamas or sandals, alarmed by the smoke. A breeze gusted, carrying sparks toward the row of pine trees. My stomach clenched. If the pines caught fire, the blaze could leap into backyards, possibly igniting the wooden fences and house sidings. The entire cul-de-sac was at risk. Instinct roared in my head. Contain it. Keep the fire from spreading. Within minutes, I heard the wail of a fire engine approaching. Relief flooded me when a rig from my station thundered into the cul-de-sac. My own crew jumped out, hoses in hand, their eyes widening slightly at seeing me on site with no gear. Chief Hastings? One called, confused. Ma'am, are you all right? I'm fine, I shouted over the roar of the engine. We need 2 lines, one to stop the spread along the fence, another along the pine trees. Let's do this quickly. Though out of uniform, I directed them with the calm, practiced authority I'd honed over years. My firefighters obeyed without question. Water arced from the hoses, drenching the hungry flames. Steam hissed. Slowly, the blaze retreated, first from the pine line, then from the straw mulch. Thick smoke hung in the air, but within 20 minutes, the worst was extinguished. Another 15 of careful dousing, and the garden fire was out. Exhausted neighbors hovered at a safe distance, hugging each other. The intense wave of fear gave way to relief. No houses were lost, though a portion of the fence had burned and half the new garden lay charred. Embers glowed in twisted tomato cages. Blackened marigold stems sagged in ruin. I stood there, sweat pouring, mind spinning. A meltdown like that didn't just start on its own, especially not in an area with no electrical wiring or equipment. My firefighting instincts told me this was suspicious, accelerants, maybe, or an open flame introduced purposely. Who found it first? I demanded. Ms. Mallory stepped forward. I was walking back from a friend's house and smelled smoke. I saw flames at the far edge, near those garden beds. Nodding grimly, I scanned the area. This wasn't a typical accidental ignition, and I recalled Karen's midnight creeping, her final solution mutterings about bugs. My gut twisted. Could she really have done something so reckless? If so, she'd nearly cost the entire neighborhood their homes, or their lives. Even as the fire trucks packed up, I launched an impromptu investigation. Though it wasn't fully in my official capacity, our city had a dedicated fire investigator. I had enough authority and expertise to start gathering evidence immediately. Carefully stepping around the charred debris, I zeroed in on a suspicious patch by the fence line. There, the ash was darker, almost greasy, suggesting a possible accelerant. I sniffed gently, detecting a faint chemical odor reminiscent of lighter fluid or gasoline. Kneeling close, I spotted a partially melted plastic container. I used a gloved hand from my personal kit, always in my car, to nudge it. The shape hinted at some sort of cheap fuel canister. "Chief, want me to rope this area off?" asked one of my firefighters, approaching. "Please," I murmured. "We'll need the official investigators, but let's not disturb anything crucial." My thoughts spun. An accelerant-laden container, in a garden with no mechanical equipment. This was looking more and more like arson. But who would set the place ablaze? And why? The final piece of the puzzle clicked when Ms. Mallory sidled up, eyes watery. "Rebecca, I can't prove it, but I saw Karen near the garden last night. She's the only one who hates it enough to do something this extreme. She's unhinged." I remembered Karen's venomous rants about bugs. Dare I believe she would stoop to burning everything down, risking the entire cul-de-sac? But the evidence wasn't pointing anywhere else. I told Ms. Mallory to keep quiet about her suspicions until the official fire investigators arrived in the morning. Let them gather physical proof. Meanwhile, I tried to keep my suspicion from boiling over into anger. Though we prevented the fire from spreading to the houses, the garden was largely destroyed. Many families had poured their hearts into those beds, and children's tears dotted the sidewalk as they stared at charred tomato vines. A sense of shock and betrayal permeated Larkspur Heights that evening. Nobody wanted to believe a neighbor could do something so heinous. But the rumors swirled, and Karen's name popped up at every turn. The next morning, I returned to the scene with the city's official fire investigator, Captain Donald Ross. We'd worked together for years. He knew my competence, so he welcomed any input. As we combed through the remnants, the shape of the incident became clearer. The fire had started in a concentrated area, consistent with an intentional ignition point. Traces of accelerant were found along a line that led from the fence to the straw. This wasn't a random spark from a cigarette or a lightning strike. It was deliberate. By midday, we'd collected enough evidence to label it as suspected arson. The melted plastic container had faint residue of a commercial lighter fluid commonly used for charcoal grills. The location, the pattern, everything pointed to a purposeful act. Now it fell to the police to investigate suspects. That afternoon, uniformed officers showed up to take statements. I provided my recollection, particularly about Karen's repeated threats. Others, like Ms. Mallory, recounted overhearing Karen vow to eliminate the bug problem once and for all. Our words formed a tapestry of circumstantial evidence. Legally, it was enough to question her. Karen herself was nowhere to be found. According to some neighbors, she'd left early that morning, claiming she had errands. The tension in the community soared. People were furious. Parents lamented the kids' lost garden. Retirees complained about wasted time and money, and everyone recognized how close they'd come to a major tragedy if the blaze had spread. By day's end, the local news had picked up the story. A TV reporter stood at the blackened garden fence, describing how a suspicious fire threatened a suburban neighborhood. My phone buzzed with calls from city officials, wanting an update. As the city's fire chief, I tried to remain objective in interviews, avoiding naming Karen publicly until we had concrete proof. But word of her mania for bug elimination seeped out. The rumor mill had no mercy. Though typically I'd keep a neutral stance, inside I was seething. Arson in any form is a vile, dangerous crime. To do it over insects, in a place where children played, was unthinkable. Part of me hoped that maybe Karen was innocent, that there was some other explanation. But each new detail pointed at her. It was only a matter of time until the police tracked her down. Karen returned late that evening. A group of neighbors spotted her pulling into her driveway. They watched as she noticed the police car parked in front of her house. She froze, eyes wide, then tried to reverse out. But an officer blocked her path, stepping forward with a gentle wave to indicate he wanted to talk. Witnesses reported that she cracked her window open just enough to speak, refusing to exit her vehicle. She demanded the officer show a warrant. Eventually, after a tense conversation, she let him see her ID. I was standing outside the taped-off garden area, finishing up some final checks, when Ms. Mallory sprinted up. "They've got her cornered," she hissed. "She's acting guilty." She tried to flee. "The officer is telling her she's a suspect in the fire." Within minutes, a second patrol car arrived. A calm but firm detective convinced Karen to step out of her vehicle. Neighbors watched from a distance, hush falling across the street. The detective spoke with her quietly, likely explaining her Miranda rights, the reason for questioning, and that she wasn't formally under arrest yet but needed to come to the station. Karen's voice rose, audible even at a distance. "Arson? Are you insane? Why would I set fire to that wretched garden? I might not like it, but I'm no criminal." She glared around as though searching for traitors. Her gaze landed on me. I was in uniform now, having returned from a short break. She bared her teeth. "I know what you're all doing. This is a witch hunt. They'll never prove I did anything." The detective's posture stiffened. He guided Karen to sit in the patrol car. She protested but eventually slipped inside, the door shutting with a heavy click. A hush spread over the cluster of onlookers. Some wore expressions of shock. Others quietly muttered that the truth was out. As the car drove away, Ms. Mallory exhaled. "Good riddance." But while Karen was brought in for questioning, that didn't guarantee an immediate arrest. The police needed enough evidence for formal charges. For all we knew, she might claim an alibi or insist the container of lighter fluid was from someone else. In arson cases, the burden of proof can be high. I could only hope our statements, plus the physical evidence, would be enough to hold her accountable. Inside, I felt both relief and dread. Relief that the prime suspect was finally in custody, dread at the possibility she might wriggle free. But I was determined that if Karen was truly responsible, she would not escape justice. Not after risking an inferno in our neighborhood over some bugs. Karen was released later that night, pending further investigation. The authorities, lacking a direct eyewitness or a confession, weren't able to hold her. Nonetheless, they filed an official complaint and seized her phone for analysis. She returned to her home under a cloud of suspicion, flanked by neighbors who scowled as she brushed past. Over the next week, tensions in Larkspur Heights soared. Several neighbors demanded the HOA remove Karen from any official position, or at least suspend her. Others posted angry notes on the community bulletin board, declaring her a menace. Yet a few individuals, still harboring old loyalties, insisted Karen couldn't have done something so monstrous. "She's controlling," one man told me, "but not a felon." I, for my part, had to juggle my role as the city's fire chief, coordinating official findings with the fire investigator, and my role as a neighbor who'd almost seen her home threatened by flames. The local news hounded me for statements. I tried to remain factual. "We have strong evidence of arson. The investigation continues," and the suspect was questioned. My refusal to name her publicly sparked rumors that I was covering up for her, but truly, I was respecting protocol. The detective assigned to the case told me they were combing Karen's text messages and phone logs, searching for anything that might indicate a plan to torch the garden. Meanwhile, an outpouring of community support emerged for rebuilding the garden. Donations of lumber, soil, and plants flooded in from all over the city, once the story of the sabotage went viral on social media. Volunteers promised to help restore the space as soon as the investigation cleared them to do so. A local gardening club offered new seedlings, a hardware store donated wood for raised beds, and kids around the neighborhood scrawled handmade signs that read, "We will regrow." In the midst of this generosity, Karen barricaded herself in her house. She posted a sign on her door stating, "No trespassing, no harassment," claiming she was the victim. Strangely, she took it upon herself to spray chemicals around her perimeter, presumably to keep away bugs. The pungent odor carried down the street. More than once, people complained to the HOA about the stench. Every time I walked past, I glimpsed her peering from the window, eyes full of hatred. When our gazes met, she'd slam the blinds. My gut twisted with unresolved fury, but I forced myself to rely on the justice system. Let the detective gather his facts. Let the district attorney decide on charges. All I could do in the meantime was help the neighbors remain calm and keep the rebuild plan on track. One day, I caught a break in the form of new evidence. While reviewing the garden site with Captain Ross, he mentioned they'd found a set of footprints in the ash, partially preserved near the fence. A shoeprint analysis had matched the size and tread of a brand commonly worn by suburban women. That wasn't conclusive, but combined with a neighbor's doorbell camera footage from the night before the fire, the picture sharpened. The doorbell camera had captured a glimpse of someone carrying a plastic container near the community garden just minutes before the blaze. The silhouette was unclear, but the timestamp matched the approximate start time. The detective told me the figure's build appeared similar to Karen's. He was close to a warrant, needing only a bit more digital evidence from her phone or conflicting statements to tie it all together. As the net tightened, Karen's behavior grew more erratic. She posted on the neighborhood's online forum, claiming she was being framed by incompetent firefighters and harassed by an HOA that refused to control pests. Her rants about bugs everywhere intensified. She wrote lengthy accusations about Ms. Mallory, me, and anyone who supported the garden, calling us eco-terrorists. The irony would have been laughable, if not for the gravity of her crime. Simultaneously, new developments rocked Larkspur Heights. Small patches of scorch marks appeared in random spots around the greenbelt. Some speculated Karen was continuing her crusade, lighting tiny fires to eliminate insect habitats. The local police stepped up patrols, searching for any sign of her prowling. A few frightened neighbors installed motion sensor lights or cameras. No one felt truly safe until Karen was behind bars. One sweltering afternoon, Ms. Mallory and I tried to install temporary signage encouraging caution around the charred garden area. We spotted Karen at the edge of her driveway, arms folded. She locked eyes with me, then spat. "You've turned them all against me. But they don't see how these bugs breed disease." I was trying to protect the community. She spoke with a mania that made my skin crawl. I approached her warily. Setting a fire was never a solution. People could have died. She scoffed. "You protect them, but not us." Typical. The big city fire chief thinks she knows everything. Then she pivoted on her heel, slamming her front door. The rancor in her voice was unnerving. If there was any lingering doubt about her guilt, it was fading. She had every motive, every bit of twisted logic to justify her crime. All we needed was that final piece of proof. Days later, the detective called me with news. They'd uncovered a crucial text message on Karen's phone. It was sent to an unknown contact, reading, "Finally done with this bug-infested garden. Fire is the only way. They'll see." The timestamp matched the night of the blaze. In typical arson or criminal mischief cases, that alone might not be slam-dunk evidence, but it strongly supported the rest. He also mentioned that Karen had purchased 2 large containers of charcoal lighter fluid at a local hardware store the day before the fire. The store's security camera footage showed her at the checkout, wearing the same outfit from the doorbell camera. With that, the detective felt confident about obtaining a warrant for her arrest. The district attorney swiftly approved it, citing the risk she might cause further harm. When the news broke that an arrest was imminent, relief swept through the neighborhood. Ms. Mallory clutched my arm, tears in her eyes. "Thank goodness. Maybe we can all sleep safely now." The next morning, the police moved in. Several patrol cars, plus the detective's unmarked vehicle, pulled up to Karen's driveway. Neighbors watched from windows as officers approached her door. She initially refused to open up, hollering that they had no right to trespass on her property. But with the legal warrant in hand, they forced the door. A tense standoff ensued for a few minutes inside. Some residents claimed they heard shouts, then a crash. Finally, the officers escorted Karen out in handcuffs. Her face was contorted with rage, tears streaking her cheeks. She screamed about how she was protecting the neighborhood from insects, insisted she'd been set up, and threatened to sue everyone. But the officers placed her in the back of the patrol car. This time, there was no release pending further inquiry. She was under formal arrest for arson, reckless endangerment, and property damage. I stood watching, heart pounding with a complex mix of triumph and sorrow. It was horrifying that a neighbor could spiral so far into obsession that she'd endanger lives. But at least now, justice was in motion. My phone buzzed with texts from city officials wanting confirmation. The local news vans rolled in, capturing footage of her in handcuffs. In that moment, I felt the intangible weight of the entire crisis lift slightly, replaced by the reality of a battered but not broken community. Karen's arrest sent ripples beyond the cul-de-sac. Local headlines blared. HOA member charged with arson in suburban garden fire. The city's social media lit up, with people decrying her actions or expressing shock that something so petty, bugs in a garden, would lead to such devastation. My phone was inundated with messages from friends, colleagues, and even the mayor, all relieved that the suspect was apprehended. Within Larkspur Heights, a mixture of emotions emerged. Some felt vindicated, particularly those who'd faced Karen's harassment for years. Others were dismayed that one of their own had nearly burned down the neighborhood. A few folks who once admired Karen's vigilance about standards admitted they'd never suspected she could go this far. Now that the immediate threat was gone, the HOA board quickly moved to rebuild the charred garden. They planned a regrow day, inviting volunteers to remove debris, install fresh wood for raised beds, and lay new mulch. Donations from local businesses poured in, from seeds and plants to gardening tools. Even those who'd never touched a trowel lined up to help, determined to show that one person's sabotage wouldn't kill the community's spirit. On the designated weekend, half the neighborhood converged at the site. Kids in gloves hauled burnt wood to dumpsters, while older residents hammered fresh boards into frames. Ms. Mallory oversaw the layout, scribbling diagrams for better spacing. I pitched in by carting wheelbarrows of topsoil, sweat soaking my shirt in the late summer heat. Laughter and chatter filled the air, a stark contrast to the tense hush that had gripped us days earlier. To honor the ordeal we'd survived, some volunteers decided to design a memorial plaque in one corner. It would read, "Renewed from the ashes, Larkspur Community Garden. United we regrow." The sentiment gave me chills, in a good way. It encapsulated our collective resilience. We weren't about to be cowed by hatred or fear. Meanwhile, a surprising number of local media outlets covered the rebuild. They interviewed me in my capacity as both neighbor and fire chief, praising the swift response of the department. I used the airtime to highlight the importance of vigilance and community bonding, offering a reminder that unity can prevail over one person's destructive impulses. If Karen had intended to destroy the garden forever, her plan backfired spectacularly. Not only were we rebuilding, but with more vigor and solidarity than ever before. The sizzling question remained: would the legal system hold her accountable to the fullest extent? For now, at least, we found solace in our newly planted beds, symbolizing hope rising from scorched ground. While Larkspur Heights came together in an inspiring show of solidarity, Karen's fate lay in the hands of the legal system. She spent several nights in jail before being released on bail, courtesy of a bail bondsman. The judge imposed strict conditions. She was barred from coming within 100 yards of the community garden, and any act of harassment or vandalism would result in immediate revocation of her bail. Even so, her presence continued to cast a shadow. Karen's court date loomed, and speculation ran rampant. Would she plead guilty to a lesser charge, or maintain her innocence and face a jury trial? The prosecutor seemed confident, given the mountain of evidence: the phone text, the store footage, the footprints, witness statements, and the accelerant container. But arson cases can be tricky if a skilled defense attorney picks holes in the chain of evidence. Karen's home sat dark most evenings, her once pristine lawn going unmowed and neglected. The HOA, in an emergency session, voted to remove her from any official capacity. Some members proposed an outright expulsion from the neighborhood association, rare, but possible under extreme circumstances. Meanwhile, Karen's only visitors were the occasional lawyer or a relative. Most neighbors avoided her property entirely, uneasy about further confrontation. I kept hearing rumors that she was hatching bizarre conspiracy theories, claiming Ms. Mallory or I had staged the entire fire to frame her, or that I, as fire chief, manipulated evidence. The thought was laughable, but it underscored her refusal to accept reality. One evening, an anonymous flyer appeared in a few mailboxes, repeating these conspiracy claims. Though it lacked a signature, the writing style reeked of Karen. Do not be fooled by false heroes. They want to let bugs run rampant. People either tossed them out or showed them to the police as possible intimidation attempts. Despite the tension, Larkspur Heights found new vigor in everyday life. The re-garden beds thrived. Children resumed playing in the cul-de-sac, parents relaxed on porches, and the dreaded possibility of an unstoppable blaze receded. Still, at night, I sometimes woke in a cold sweat, recalling how close we'd come. The black smoke, the frantic water hoses, the potential for tragedy if we hadn't contained it fast. Yet for all her destructive malice, Karen was ultimately just one person. The rest of us outnumbered her, and our sense of community outmatched her anger. That realization fueled a deep gratitude within me, gratitude for the unity that overshadowed fear. As summer melted into a crisp fall, Karen's preliminary hearing arrived. A cluster of neighbors attended the courthouse, though I stayed outside, respecting the formality. I'd provided statements in writing through official channels, so I wasn't required to testify this early. The prosecutor laid out the evidence, painting a grim picture of how Karen's arson endangered an entire neighborhood. Karen's attorney tried to argue insufficient proof of her presence at the ignition point. According to Ms. Mallory and others who observed, Karen sat with a defiant glare, arms crossed. When the prosecutor read the phone text quoting her vow to use fire as a solution, she reportedly leaned over to her lawyer, whispering furiously. The judge found enough probable cause to proceed with a full trial, rejecting any attempt to dismiss the case. Karen's expression turned sour. In the following weeks, the possibility of a plea bargain arose. Rumors said the prosecutor offered her a deal: plead guilty to second-degree arson, serve a moderate sentence, and pay restitution to the community. She'd also have to attend mandated counseling. But word on the street was that Karen refused. She believed she could prove her innocence, or at least sow enough doubt to walk free. Maybe she thought her neighborhood standing would sway a jury, or that the conspiracy angle would confuse matters. Truthfully, I dreaded a drawn-out trial that forced neighbors to relive the ordeal. The garden had already been replanted. Families wanted to move on. But justice had to run its course. Setting a fire was no trivial misdeed. If Karen refused to repent, she risked a harsher penalty. Meanwhile, Larkspur Heights settled into normalcy. The new garden beds flourished with autumn crops, kale, pumpkins, and late-season peppers. A local scout troop visited, marveling at the revived space. I felt a swell of pride each time I passed, recalling how, just a month ago, it was a burnt wasteland. The community's resilience had triumphed over malice. As for Karen, her presence was sporadic. Occasionally, she'd shuffle out to pick up her mail, glancing warily around as if expecting torches and pitchforks. But no one harassed her physically. The communal scorn was silent yet palpable. She'd reaped the consequences of her destructive obsession. Now she faced the legal system's judgment. By late October, the trial date was set. Anticipation rippled through Larkspur Heights. Some residents dreaded being called as witnesses, while others insisted it was time Karen faced the full consequences. The local news occasionally revisited the story, labeling it the community garden arson case, a cautionary tale about how personal vendettas can escalate. The morning of the trial arrived crisp and cool, with fallen leaves crunching underfoot as neighbors trickled into the courthouse. I wore my Class A fire chief uniform out of respect for the judicial setting. Ms. Mallory, Mr. Contreras, and a handful of others came prepared to testify. The mood was subdued, a bit tense. Nobody took pleasure in dragging a neighbor through court, but justice had to be served. Opening statements painted Karen as a cunning saboteur with a pathological hatred of insects. The prosecutor highlighted her repeated threats, the suspicious footprints, the phone text, and the hardware store purchase. He called me to the stand early, asking about the potential danger of the blaze. I answered calmly, detailing how the fire nearly spread to the pines, endangering homes. I made it clear that in my professional opinion, the use of accelerants indicated intent. Karen's defense attorney tried to sow doubt. He questioned the reliability of footprints, pointed out that other people disliked insects too, and suggested the store footage only proved she bought lighter fluid, not that she used it. He even implied Ms. Mallory or someone else could have stolen Karen's fluid to frame her. This borderline conspiratorial approach raised eyebrows in the courtroom. But the prosecution hammered back with the text message, where Karen mentioned fire is the only way. They introduced additional testimony from a store clerk who remembered Karen's odd rant about hating pest-filled gardens, plus the neighbors' accounts of her repeated threats. Over the course of several days, a grim mosaic of evidence formed, making it hard to see Karen as the victim she claimed to be. Karen herself took the stand, tearfully proclaiming she was framed, that the neighborhood always ganged up on her because she enforced standards. She insisted the phone text was taken out of context, referencing some obscure plan to light tiki torches near her yard to repel mosquitoes. The jury seemed unmoved, noting her contradictions when cross-examined. Finally, closing arguments concluded. The jury deliberated for less than a day. When they returned with a verdict of guilty on multiple counts, second-degree arson, reckless endangerment, property destruction, Karen's face went ashen. The judge remanded her to custody pending sentencing. Some in the gallery gasped, others breathed sighs of relief. I found Ms. Mallory's hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. Justice at last. While tragic that a neighbor's life derailed so completely, the fact remained. She'd committed a crime that could have cost many their homes or lives. Karen's sentencing hearing came a few weeks later, just as autumn leaves began yielding to the chill of early winter. In a packed courtroom, the judge reviewed the severity of Karen's actions. He cited how her deliberate act endangered not only property, but also human lives, including children who might have been near the fire. He read aloud from a statement from our fire department, underscoring how quickly the blaze could have spread if not for timely intervention. Karen, dressed in a plain blouse, stood with her head bowed. Gone was the haughty confidence. Whether she felt genuine remorse or just fear of punishment, none could say. The prosecutor requested a meaningful prison sentence, noting that arson is rarely just a petty crime, particularly in a residential area. Karen's defense attorney pleaded for leniency, citing her history as an upstanding HOA member and claiming she overreacted to a perceived threat of pests. In the end, the judge handed down a mixed ruling: 18 months of prison time, followed by 2 years of supervised probation, mandatory psychiatric evaluation and therapy, focusing on anger management and destructive tendencies, restitution to cover the damage to the community garden and city fire response costs. Karen's shoulders slumped as the sentence was read. She stared at the floor, offering a barely audible apology. It sounded forced, but perhaps it was the start of acceptance. The bailiff led her away. Outside the courthouse, a few neighbors conferred with the media. Ms. Mallory told reporters, "We're relieved justice was served and no one was hurt. Our garden has grown back stronger, and so has our community." That night, a hush settled over Larkspur Heights, a quiet sense of resolution. The threat had finally passed. I gazed at the stars from my back porch, reflecting on the ordeal. The garden fiasco had tested our neighborhood's unity, but it had also illuminated just how strong we could be when we rallied together. I felt a surge of pride, not just in the fire department's swift response, but in the ordinary folks who refused to be bullied or divided by fear. For better or worse, Karen's name would forever linger as a cautionary tale, a reminder that obsessions and grudges can bloom into destructive acts if left unchecked. But her downfall also underscored something else. A single person's maliciousness cannot overcome a collective spirit of compassion and cooperation. With Karen gone, life in Larkspur Heights turned a new page. The HOA held an election to fill her vacant seat, opting for a mild-tempered individual who favored community consensus rather than rigid enforcement. The garden, now boasting late-season kale and spinach, became a focal point for neighborhood gatherings. We installed a covered pergola and set up benches, turning the once-scorched site into a thriving communal hub. In early December, the neighborhood decided to host a holiday festival in the garden, complete with a small tree lighting, hot cocoa stands, and kids singing carols. It felt symbolic, celebrating in the very spot someone had tried to destroy. When the evening arrived, lanterns lined the walkways, and families huddled in scarves and coats, marveling at how the place had transformed. Ms. Mallory's eyes shimmered with tears as she recounted the fire's aftermath and how neighbors poured love and labor into the rebuild. I, too, felt a swell of gratitude. Even though my profession dealt with danger daily, seeing a close-knit community triumph over adversity was special. During a break in the festivities, I chatted with Mr. Contreras, who commended me for stepping in that day to help extinguish the blaze. "You saved us," he said earnestly. I deflected the praise. "We saved ourselves. If you all hadn't formed a bucket brigade and alerted the station so quickly, it could have been far worse." His gaze drifted to the new plant beds. "Karen destroyed a garden, but ended up uniting us. Crazy how that works." I nodded. Sometimes crisis fosters resilience. Doesn't justify her act, but it shows the strength of a neighborhood that cares. Under twinkling lights, Ms. Mallory unveiled the new plaque at the garden's entrance, a simple bronze sign reading, "From Ashes to Bloom. The Larkspur Community Garden, celebrating growth, unity, and renewal." Applause rippled through the crowd. Children hopped up and down with excitement. Parents hugged each other, and I felt tears sting my eyes. We had come full circle, from devastation to celebration. Though the gardens thrived, the memory of the fire lingered as a lesson. The HOA revised its rules to ensure no single individual had unchecked power. They implemented clear guidelines for addressing disputes, requiring group votes before drastic measures. People took more interest in monthly meetings, wanting to keep the community spirit strong. The petty intimidation that once prevailed under Karen's watch gave way to transparency and mutual respect. Occasionally, a new neighbor asked about the burned garden story, having heard rumors. They'd be regaled with tales of how a single arson attempt nearly leveled our orchard of tomatoes and basil, only to spark a stronger unity. Even the local press lauded Larkspur Heights as a shining example of rebuilding after sabotage. The city council recognized us in a small ceremony, praising our volunteerism and willingness to stand against destructive acts. As the weeks rolled on, I sank back into my routine at the fire station. My responsibilities never ceased: drills, managing budgets, overseeing safety inspections across the city. But whenever I returned home, I'd pass the vibrant garden, greeting neighbors who waved or called out invites to a potluck. The nights no longer echoed with the tension of potential arson. The air smelled of fresh mulch and a whiff of apple pie from Ms. Mallory's window. I often reflected on the irony that Karen had no clue I was the city's fire chief until it was too late. If she had known, maybe she wouldn't have dared start that blaze. Or perhaps it wouldn't have changed a thing. Her obsession with eradicating bugs overshadowed rational thought. Either way, her ignorance led to her downfall. In a sense, my presence ensured the fastest response possible, saving the neighborhood from a bigger catastrophe. With time, the conversation shifted away from the fire, focusing instead on new projects: a neighborhood mural, a possible greenhouse addition, or a pollinator-friendly flower bed. The mention of bugs no longer carried the stigma of Karen's fear-mongering. Instead, families taught their kids about beneficial insects and natural pest control, turning the fiasco into an educational springboard. Spring arrived, bringing fresh blossoms around Larkspur Heights. The garden, now well-established, saw a new wave of planting: peas, radishes, early lettuce. Children raced to claim their favorite spots. Ms. Mallory introduced a compost bin to reduce waste, teaching folks how to turn kitchen scraps into rich soil. The entire place hummed with life. One Saturday, the HOA organized a garden-to-table event. Residents prepared dishes using produce from the garden: zesty salads, herb-infused breads, fresh fruit bowls. A local band played acoustic music, and laughter rang out from checkered picnic blankets. I wore my casual clothes, enjoying the day with zero mention of sirens or emergencies. At one point, a small group gathered around me, expressing gratitude for my quick thinking the day of the fire. A retired teacher said, "I've lived here 30 years, and that was the scariest day. You took charge without hesitation." I tried to direct credit back to the entire community, but they insisted I'd made the difference. Flushed with humility, I thanked them, feeling an overwhelming sense of belonging. Reflecting on the year's upheaval, I realized how strongly the fire had tested and ultimately shaped Larkspur Heights. The synergy between neighbors, the focus on safety, and the blossoming sense of pride in the gardens all stemmed from rising above adversity. We refused to let fear or hostility define us. News from Karen's camp was sparse. Word had it she was appealing her sentence, but few cared about the details. Most of us had moved on, focusing on positivity and growth. While I believed in second chances, I also knew her acts had nearly caused irreparable harm. If she learned anything, hopefully it was that obsession leads nowhere good. In the meantime, we kept building the neighborhood she once tried to tear apart. By evening, the garden-to-table event wrapped up with a bonfire. Ironically, a small, well-controlled flame in a fire pit, far from any greenery. Families gathered to roast marshmallows, reminding each other of the difference between a safe, communal fire and a reckless act of arson. Someone joked, "Karen must be rolling in her jail cell," and we all chuckled, then let the conversation drift to pleasant topics: summer plans, kids' sports, and upcoming block parties. A full year passed from the day Karen ignited the community garden. Larkspur Heights had not only recovered, but blossomed into a shining example of suburban unity. The new expansions included a small orchard corner, apple and pear saplings that local scouts helped plant. An herb walkway showcased aromatic plants for neighbors to use in cooking. People even started a monthly produce swap, turning the garden into a hub of neighborly interaction. The final note of closure arrived when the City Council awarded Larkspur Heights an official, Outstanding Community Resilience Certificate. At a small ceremony in the newly refurbished garden, the mayor praised everyone for turning tragedy into triumph. Cameras flashed as Ms. Mallory and the HOA president, flanked by beaming residents, accepted the honor. I stood beside them, equally proud though reluctant to hog the spotlight. The moment captured our metamorphosis from victims of a reckless fire to champions of communal harmony. Afterwards, I strolled through the garden, pausing at the memorial plaque that read, "From Ashes to Bloom." My gaze landed on the vibrant rows of vegetables and flowers. Butterflies flitted about, unbothered by any hostility. The crisp air smelled of basil and damp soil, reminiscent of new beginnings. Quietly, I remembered the scorching flames, the fear in neighbors' eyes, the heartbreak of losing those first plants. Now, it felt distant, subsumed by renewal. Thinking of Karen, I had no illusions she might see reason from behind bars, but it no longer mattered. She'd inflicted damage, yes, but inadvertently galvanized us to create something stronger and more beautiful. Perhaps one day she'd reflect on her actions and realize the cost of letting hatred overshadow compassion. Until then, Larkspur Heights forged ahead, unafraid. A child darted by, chasing a bright green grasshopper, giggling. I smiled, noting how ironically, we'd come to embrace the very insects Karen despised. Life thrived here because we nurtured it, not tried to obliterate it. That was our secret. We chose growth over destruction. With a contented sigh, I left the garden, heading back to my home at the end of the cul-de-sac. The path was lined with sunflowers, swaying gently in the breeze. I ran a hand across their petals, feeling the warmth of a community that had triumphed over a senseless act. In a world of turmoil, Larkspur Heights stood as a testament to perseverance, unity, and the power of a well-tended garden to bring people together, no matter the flames that once threatened to tear us apart.